Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm joined by my nemesis and friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Philip, hello, how are you?
Hello, AP. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing very, very well. So today
Good.
we're going to do our spoiler chat for Reaper's Gale, and there is a lot to get through in this book. So I think we'll try and divide it up into sort of clumps of characters and story arcs, almost by region as we go through. So we'll start with hopefully Red Mask and the quest group, uh, moving on to the Hedge and the Refugium,
Mhm.
then having a look at some of the stuff going on in Letharis, and we'll finish off with the Malazans. But all of this is dependent on time because there's a lot in this book. So what are your sort of your opening impressions? It's spoiler talk. Let's talk about Reaper's Gale, book 7 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erikson. What are your first opening thoughts about it?
Wow. Well, starting with Red Mask and Atra Prida, Bivat, and Brol Handar, and that whole business off in the east of the Lethari Empire, and the conflict which is set up by the acquisitiveness, the expansionist tendencies of the Letharos Empire. This ongoing um, gobbling of the territory of the all. And I think it's a very poignant part of Reaper's Gale. It's a powerful part for me. Actually, it's a part that I quite enjoyed, to tell you the truth. The whole Red Mask narrative and the idea of this culture that is under threat, that is disappearing because of an aggressive expansionist capitalist culture that is its neighbor, and it has done it to other cultures obviously as well, and that's dealt with a lot in Midnight Tides, and we can see that the same thing is happening to the all, and they're on their last legs really, and when Red Mask comes along, and it's a difficult one because there are in typical Eriksonian style, there are a lot of moments where I admire Atraprita Bivat, and I admire Brol Handar, and they're in a kind of a dance there as well because of the politics within the Lethari Empire, where you have the Tais Edor, who are nominally the overlords, they're in charge, but you also have them being subsumed, being eaten up by this Lethari culture. And there's a lot of politics and a lot of backstabbing and a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that Brol Handar is a bit naive about. And you have this Atraprita, who is she's protecting him but can't tell him that she's doing it, and it's a lot going on there. So you feel for her. There's a lot of nobility there, and of course they belong to this expansionist culture on the other hand. And then you have the All under Red Mask, and you can't help but feel for them because they're the ones under threat. So it's a tough one when they have their conflict and they have their battles, and it's a part of you in the initial battle, where Red Mask triumphs, where they have the battle on the plane where the magic is dead, and that part is really well done. I mean, and then later the catastrophe, the disaster that ends with them all covered in mud, and you can't tell who is who, and which is appropriate, isn't it? Since we're feeling for all of these different sides, how appropriate that they're all covered in mud and indistinguishable from one another at that point. So there's a lot of tragedy, and as we said during the non-spoiler discussion, there's a lot of futility, I think, to this thread in Reaper's Gale.
Well, one of the things that I think is fascinating, particularly about the Red Mask storyline, think back to Gardens of the Moon, an expansionist empire, a native population that is being gobbled up by it.
Yeah.
Where have I heard that before?
Hmm.
And we're seeing both sides of the conflict. Huh. Where have I heard that before? And we are seeing internal, im, empirical, internal imperial, sorry, not empirical, imperial, internal imperial power plays
Yeah.
affecting the course of the campaign.
Yeah.
Where have I seen that before? This is one of these wonderful aspects where something like you don't, when you read Red Mask storyline, you don't immediately think of Lorne and Perrin and Bivat and the Eater.
Yeah.
But when you make that connection, you go, oh, there are a lot of similarities. And seeing both sides of the conflict. Yes, we've seen this before. And then it brings in that aspect that we saw in Deadhouse Gates of Coltain's Crow clan. What happened to the Wiccans when they became part of the Malazan Empire? Some of their individuality was stripped away. Some of their tribal practices were stripped away, and they were absorbed into the Malazan Empire. But at the same time, there's an aspect that they remain the Wiccans. They remain these people. We've seen this play out multiple times in the series, that empires expand. That's what empires do. And it is such a complicated question. Like, it is very, very easy for us to say colonialism, bad. You go, congratulations, that is undeniably true. Let's move on. But there are aspects of colonialism that have benefits. Do they outweigh the detriments? That's an entirely different evaluative judgment. But think about why did the Wiccans join Kellamved? Because he showed them a future where they weren't killing each other, where they could grow and flourish as a people, and they could still have their own territory. We see how Lucene, then, the new head of that empire, betrays that trust.
Right.
The scene in Life of Brian where it's what have the Romans ever done for us? The aqueducts.
Apart from the aqueducts, yeah.
It is rarely as simple as it's just bad. And that is part of, I think, what Erikson is exploring. And again, it's an exploration of these things. It's not a didactic or polemic on the subject. It's an exploration. And we see it from both sides. We see it from multiple angles. We're given that space within the narrative to investigate it for ourselves, to make up our own minds, and to see whether or not we think we fall one way or another on the question. And it's a different way of exploring something that is so complex. And when we apply it to our own world, when we think of our own world history, we can get very caught up in the intense feelings of, say, patriotism, or the tribalism that we feel, the need to support X position or Y position. But when we move it into fantasy, we can actually take that space, take that psychic distance, and think about it from a position where it is not immediately pulling on our preconceived notions about where we should be standing on a subject, and actually think about it from a distance to get a better grasp of it. Mightn't change our minds, but that's part of, I think, what Erikson explores in this. Because there are undeniable benefits to certain aspects of colonial expansion, and there are undeniable atrocities committed as part of colonial expansion. It's a complicated picture.
Yeah. And to add one more wrinkle to the whole thing, the reveal at the end that Red Mask is in fact Letharis, that he's not an all, that he was, this is of course kind of playing into the idea of, or toying with the idea of the savior complex and all of that. But that does add an interesting wrinkle to this whole situation, doesn't it?
Well, and I think Erikson himself has described it as very much like Lawrence of Arabia, the white savior riding in and becoming more tribal, like Paul Atreides being more Fremen than the Fremen, this being more rooted in the culture than the people whose culture it is. That there are stories like that, we do have these stories being promoted again and again. Dances with Wolves, another quite famous one.
Yeah.
But even historically, the story of Grey Owl, the environmentalist, who, you know, was an English guy. I think he was it up in Canada where he lived, and he then was adopted into a First Nation tribe, went back, and he gave all of these stories about trying to save the beaver in the forests because he used to be a trapper and then realized how integral the beaver was to the whole maintenance of that entire ecosystem. And then was discredited because it turned out no, he was actually English, and he'd gone out there as a trapper as a young man. Because he wasn't a First Nation person. And it's highly complex. And when we live in this time where identity politics is a loaded term, but cultural importance and the idea of cultural appropriation or the idea of celebrating a culture can cause tension and flashpoints. And we see this sometimes as someone has stolen someone else's culture, and that's one way of viewing it. But one of the interesting things about narrative is obviously this ability to change perspective. So if you think of a white guy with dreadlocks, oh, that's appropriating culture from a different cultural background. Or you can change the narrative perspective and say that cultural background won the culture war because now people are adopting that culture. And that is part of what we see explored in Reaper's Gale. The idea that you can have a cultural identity and it can be subsumed by another culture, or you can subsume another culture. We see that tension between the Eater and the Lethari. We see that with Red Mask, someone who was Lethari by birth, but had been raised as all. How do we define culture in those circumstances? Are we saying that adopted people belong to a different culture than their families? And it's a complicated picture. And when we take that step to, it's a very simple, straightforward, here's the nice reductionist, simplistic, ideological position. We deny the complexity of life, the complexity of these cultural interactions that we have. I live in Northern Ireland. I know an awful lot about American culture because American media comes over. So how much of that is affecting the culture of Northern Ireland? Should I forswear all American media for fear that it is infiltrating my cultural awareness? These are complex issues, and they apply across a whole spectrum from very, very important things to smaller things that are negligible or maybe even trivial. And it is this complex web of interactions. And again, Erikson explores it. He doesn't make a polemic. He doesn't make it a didactic message.
Right. Well, you can't forswear American media because then you couldn't watch Dr. Fantasy.
But Red Mask's story, and you made this point about the two major sort of battles that we have with Red Mask. And I think these are fascinating because, again, making that point of connection back to Coltane and the Chain of Dogs. When Coltane was using a lot of the Wiccan techniques and being aware of that and playing into his strengths, he was fending off these attacks. And when the attackers were just ignoring, oh, we have all of the numbers, that's why they kept failing. Here we have Red Mask at the beginning with his hit and run attacks, with his negating the Lethari strategic advantage and the Eater strategic advantage. And they all didn't have combat magic. The Lethari and Eater did. So negate that and then use fast moving tactics because they didn't realize it. That magically dead area is so important to the success of that battle. But
then when he tries to use the Lethari tactics later on, doesn't work out so well.
And we have seen this about the tension between the tactics of the past, the methods of the past, tradition, and how that tradition can be incredibly important and also incredibly damaging. That, again, complex picture. And this is why I love these books so much. It's not about a simple answer. And when we see Red Mask, this character, discard his own identity to give everything over to be this prophesied one, hiding his own features so that he is a mythic character, and gives everything over to this cause. And you go, oh, this is the subsuming of the individual, immersing himself, using the traditional weapons of that strange axe and the bladed whip, which, really kind of cool. But what happens at the end? He's caught riding away and leaving everyone to die behind him. He's a coward. He wasn't the prophesied one. He wasn't the true leader, because that's not how real life works. It's not about that one individual. It's about the entire community. It's
and
about
ultimately he is cut down by his buddies, the Kachang Jamal, in the midst of it, seemingly for his failure to win, I suppose. But they're done with him.
And his failure of courage. Facing off against that enemy, and he left everyone to die. Men, women, children, he didn't care. He rode off on his own. And he is not a heroic figure. He casts himself in that role. But we see how brutal he is. We see how he mistreats people. But at the same time, he treats Tok quite well. And again, it's this bundle of contradictions.
Well, there's the one elder that he chokes to death, right? Because the elder knows his secret. And that's an important, I think, moment in his development as well, isn't it?
And again, what characters in this series can you say are 100% good?
Right.
When we talk about moral ambiguity, when we talk about, we like complex characters, here is a complex character. Complex motivations, complex cultural connections, complex historical connections, complex allegories and symbolism worked into it. This Red Mask is a truly complex character. And this is what fantasy can do.
Well, speaking of complex characters, should we start talking about this quest group? Because there's some really interesting dynamics going on there. I feel like Erikson does the bickering quest group really well. We had in Deadhouse Gates, we had Felicin and her group, and here we have a group that's they're ready to just kind of, you've got Udanas and Fear who are at each other. You've got Saren Pedic, who's a mess. You've got Silkus Ruin, who's a big mystery and ready to, destroy who knows what. And of course, they're joined by the winning personality of Clip, the most messed up one of all. And of course, you've got little Kettle with them. So it's quite a motley collection of the dysfunctional, isn't it?
But again, think about all of the different little groups like this that we have seen throughout the series. This is very obviously a quest group. They're on a quest for the Finis. That's what they're doing. This is like so stereotypically the fantasy trope and cliche of the quest group. But we've seen this, the original Bridge Burner squad. We've seen the Phoenix Inn crowd. We've seen the various squads in the Bonehunters. Everything gets broken down into these little groups. And we realize that when we talk about the quest narrative or the quest group, it's actually one aspect of this idea of a small collection of people. And when we have seen all of those military squads, how many of them have all gotten along? They bicker, they fight, the infighting. This is just another variant of that, exploring a different dynamic, this time focused on an external goal, an acquisitive goal, and in that more quest driven nature of let's walk across the country very, very slowly to go and get the magical object.
Yeah.
And does it work out the way that we expect? Nope.
No, well, and it's interesting too because they don't even start out with the same goal. They want to do something different with Scavendari Blood Eye's soul, obviously. So Fear wants to revive that soul in order to redeem the Teist Edur and save them from the crippled gods' machinations and manipulations. And whereas Silkus Ruin, he wants a bit of vengeance for being stuck in that Azath for, what was it, hundreds of thousands of years or whatever. And he seems a bit of a mystery too the whole time. Poor Udanas and Saren Pedic, their motives seem a little cloudier in some sense, but they are somehow integral, nevertheless, to this group. And what you have, I think, emerging, there are some beautiful moments amidst the bickering, particularly with Udanas and his constantly, very almost cynically pointing out how they're trying to fit a certain narrative, but he's undercutting that all the time, especially with Fear. And there's the dynamic between, there's the former master and slave here. And he keeps mocking Fear's desire to be the hero and undercutting that narrative constantly. Udanas is very perceptive, and I think he's also a very sensitive person. And his observations are actually, he's very perceptive. I mean, what he sees in the other characters, and he knows kind of what they're going to do before they do it even. So he's an interesting character, Udanas. One I feel for as well in his hurt, his pain is really there to see.
And again, there are certain characters, and we saw this with, say, Felison and Deadhouse Gates, that can be very, very divisive because Felison, and we understand why, but Felison acts out. She is destructive. She lashes out all around her. She has very valid reasons for doing it.
Right.
Udanas, I think, in some respects, is a similar character.
Mm-hmm.
He's been a slave. He has been mistreated and beaten and physically assaulted his entire life. He's been raped. He is now on this quest where Fear is pretending that he's this noble warrior going on a quest. And he's like, you betrayed your brother and left your brother behind. Stop acting like a bloody noble. You kept me as a slave. Anytime I made a mistake or one of you was in a bad mood, my back got shredded. Don't pretend that you are this noble, heroic warrior on a quest. That's just insulting. That, again, the complexity of this, Udanas can come across as very grating, and the fly in the ointment, the sand in the grease that's rubbing away at all of these gears. And yet he is perceptive. He does have this perspective on events that the others are lying to themselves about. And we see that even with Saren Pedic, that she moves in and out of self-awareness and self-delusion, or sorry, self-illusion, if we think of Makra and what she's getting involved in her mastery of Makra. That this engagement with illusion magic is seductive. And she ends up, I think, at certain points deceiving herself.
Yes.
And falling into wanting to believe the lie, because the lie is actually reassuring. The truth is uncomfortable. And again, that aspect of power corrupting is worked into her character. She's found this newfound magical power, but it's not as simple as, oh, well, I will use it judiciously. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings taught us this very lesson.
Yeah.
Power corrupts. And so when we look at that quest group, if we think of all of those other quests, Merry and Pippin didn't go on the quest with Frodo and Sam for the same reason that Frodo went or Sam went. They all had their different reasons. Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn, again, join for different reasons. Boromir joins for a different reason. And there's a little tiny bit of bickering and sniping in that group, but not a huge amount. There are certain moments.
Gandalf can be grumpy. Yeah.
Gandalf can be grumpy, and the hobbits can be useless, but full of a took. But when we think of all of these groups in fantasy, so often you see this group and they're all from these different backgrounds and different cultures and different races, and they're like, oh, we're all going to go on a quest, and we're within a day the best of friends. Quest friends are the best friends.
Oh, dear.
And you go, that's not going to happen. Have you ever been stuck in a car with someone for 12 hours? Yeah,
Yes.
you want to stab them in the eye.
Yeah.
And they've been going on this quest for months. The only company they've had are each other.
Yeah.
And that can grate on anyone. And I think
plus
Erikson,
their lives are in danger as well. It's stressful, for sure. But one of the most tragic moments for me is when Saren uses that Makra to invade Udinas's mind, and that is just so sad. And so, because they have a kind of a nice relationship in some ways. Of all the people in that group, I feel like Udinas had little something. Of course, he's protective of Kettle as well, and he kind of seems to know what's going to happen to Kettle. That she's going to somehow or other, it's not going to be a good ending for little Kettle. That she's going to be a sacrificial victim in a way. And it turns out that she's an Azath. So that's really cool. By the way, that was the first time I read it. Was very surprised at that moment when Silkas Ruin pokes, stabs the Kettle and makes that the Azath that surrounds Scavendari Blood Eye's soul, right?
But
so, sorry, you were going to say something.
You were surprised by that?
The first time I read it, I was actually, I was surprised, I admit, about that ending. I know there are lots of flags along the way, looking back, but yeah.
Oh, okay. But I was going to say, this is one of those aspects. Again, going back to Gardens of the Moon.
Yeah.
We saw exactly this in Gardens of the Moon. Like
Yeah.
we saw this thing happen, and here we're seeing it again in much closer detail with more knowledge.
Yeah, but we hadn't seen an Azath that could procreate itself or whatever they do through a seeming body, a human, right? I mean, that part is new.
But okay, well,
that she was a vessel for the Azath of course I knew it this time, but the first time I remember being, oh my goodness, okay, so I don't know, maybe I'm slow, but
no, it's this very surprising moment because I think seeing Silka stab her is quite shocking, because we think of Kettle as a child. We forget the fact that she was a semi-immortal serial killer.
Right.
Because we think of her as a little girl.
Yeah.
Instead of the mass murdering sociopath that she was in Midnight Tides, because we have very short memories. Right. And she only killed bad people and drank their blood. So that makes it all okay. But they are a fascinating group because they grate on each other. But to go back to what you were the point that you made about Saren Pedek's invasion of Udinas's mind, this is one more assault, one more rape of him.
Yeah.
One more person who has betrayed the trust that he put in them. And when we start thinking about it from that perspective, it is amazing how balanced Udinas actually is, considering what he has gone through.
Yeah.
But
he has
it's
some
also
consolation. There is some consolation for him as well in the form of his son, Rud Ilal, whom he meets in the Refugium. I think there's some beauty to that moment when they're sitting there at the end next to each other, and they're kind of trying to come up with, they're looking out at the world, at nature, as this fierce, competitive, vicious place. And yet I think there is also, because remember they were seeing the one, it's not a bison, but it's a bison-like creature who had been isolated from the rest of the herd. And they were thinking, oh, it's going to die. And you could see them kind of wanting to help. And then you could see their relief when it was reunited with the rest of the herd. And it's just such a great metaphor there of the child being reunited with the parents. And there you have the son and the And the father, although ironically, I think it's the father who gets more consolation from the son here. So I just found it a beautiful moment there where it's one of those moments of light in all this darkness that help us to feel like it's all worthwhile, you know?
And now cast your memory back to the prologue of Memories of Ice.
Uh-huh.
And this is the inverse
Yeah.
of what we saw in Memories of Ice, where the children got taken away and it caused all of this pain, and it led to the creation of a tyrant and
Yeah.
And here we see it in reverse. Again, we have a rent. We have a parent and child being separated, but this actually is the happy ending.
Yeah.
So it's this wonderful mirroring that we get of all of these different issues throughout the entire series. So I love that this aspect happens, and it is almost a direct mirror of that storyline from Memories of Ice.
Uh-huh.
Again, with the animal imagery included, it's a
Yeah.
very similar aspect.
Yeah, in Memories of Ice, it was the eye, wasn't it? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
So will we talk a little bit about Hedge's journey leading into the Refugium, and that sort of linking up, because that is fascinating. Either that, or we could talk about Clip and how he's really annoying. Which do you want to do first?
Forget Clip. Let's do the Clip is annoying, and I feel for him. He's got that emo thing going. So poor Clip, I guess. But
I'll tell you one thing that I loved about that the whole thing with Clip was he had kept saying that he was the knight all the way through, and he's the assassin. Because of course, if you're an assassin, you're not going to tell people you're an assassin.
I'm an assassin, yeah.
And that moment when they realize that those rings on the chain that he has been playing with, like it's some sort of fidget spinner for months on end,
right?
When they realize it's a garrote.
Yeah.
And that moment of that sudden realization, is your stomach kind of just drops away. You get that feeling sinking in the pit of your stomach, because you have been thinking of it. Yes, he's young and annoying, but he's the knight of, he's one of those. No, he's a cold-blooded sociopath.
Turns out that it works really well when he uses it on fear at the end there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. And is it the first time we've seen someone beheaded with a chain?
Oh, Bowden, yeah.
And do you see what I mean by when you start picking up on the parallels and you see these things from that different perspective, and it gives certain things a different resonance?
Yeah.
And so just even thinking of that scene with Bowden now and thinking of that scene with Clip, you're seeing different thing. You're seeing the same thing, but in slightly different ways with a slightly different inference or tone.
Yeah. Very interesting. So the Refugium and what's happening with that, and how it is, I think, one of the more beautiful, more touching aspects of Reaper's Gale, and particularly the journey that you have Onrack undergoing, and his discovery of his humanity, and how that affects his companions, including Quickben, not just Troll, but Quickben. It's just brilliantly done how we're kind of watching this happen through Quickben's eyes and Troll's eyes, as Onrack is discovering his not just his memories, but his humanity and what it means to feel again. And it's almost this innocence to it that is really quite refreshing and beautiful, in contrast to what we're used to seeing with the Talana Mas, of course, right? So that's kind of neat, and I love that.
Well, I mean, just before we talk about that, when Hedge is walking through Hood's realm to get to the Refugium,
to get there with the other Talana Mas,
with the other Talana Mas, but before he meets her, there's this whole sequence where he's talking and arguing with the wind. Hood's breath, that swear that we have heard so many times, and it's the cold wind of death.
Yeah.
And he's having a conversation with Hood's breath, the literalization of this.
Yeah.
So, it's such a lovely, understated moment, and it unconsciously ties in all of these things that we've been hearing about. So it's going to be interesting to see how Hood's balls get explored.
Oh no!
But that moment when he conjures, because he's dead, and it's basically his will forming this, and he conjures the cusser and blows up the Talana Mass.
Yeah.
Mere feet from when she would have become alive again.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a tough one.
That tragedy in that moment, because she may or may not have experienced the same thing as Onrack. She may have still carried on with her mission. She may have not learned anything, or she could have become alive and not be undead anymore. She could have become alive again and started feeling again. And that tragedy, that loss, and if we think of the futility and tragedy of the all storyline, we see it reflected here. That one moment, inches from victory, inches from positive change. So I think we see that in a lot of these storylines. These turning points that sometimes you just fall short of. You fall short of your goal.
We do kind of get her opposite, though, in the Tlanamas who have entered the Refugium, who are there along with the innocent ones within it. And they had come to basically, I think, corrupt the place, right? That was their mission, if I'm not mistaken, that they were there to create mischief, right? Which is what she was doing as well. But they kind of were turned, weren't they? And ended up being defending and helping in the end there when they fought against, I forget which of the three.
Menador and
which Sukul and Kudu maybe was the one that they killed, and that she killed them when they had transformed the two Bonecasters had transformed into the bears, and that was quite a scene. But they were turned in a sense, I guess. So who knows if she had been allowed, if Hedge hadn't blown her up. And he had bits of flesh on him too. It wasn't just, she had actually transformed, I think, and he had bits of her flesh on him.
But as soon as he walks through, they become mortal. So this aspect of timing, the changing from life to death, from death to life, this is hugely important. That in those moments, immense change can happen. And it's not always convenient. It's not always going to be the narratively convenient choice.
Right.
So I think that's a brilliant point about those other Talana Mass. That could have been her. She could have had that moment to become mortal again, to become alive again, and then freed from that collective focus and the mission of the Talana Mass to feel again and become herself, become an individual, and make the decision for herself. And she's denied that.
And we do have the consolation, though, of Onrack discovering that he has a son, and with Kilava, no less, who is the leader in the Refugium. So,
and there's a complex relationship.
A little bit, yeah.
And of course that answers the question that we had back in the prologue of Memories of Ice about why was Kilava able to breastfeed.
Yes, because she had a kid.
And now we have that story as well. We can see these pieces that were set out in the narrative. We suddenly are seeing the other bits and pieces that connect to them, and then we see how they connect to the broader picture. So they're just small moments dropped in, and you suddenly, when you take that moment to take a step back and think, you go, oh, and there's click, 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 click. And much more of the mosaic, much more of the tapestry becomes visible.
Right. It's interesting how the Refugium becomes this place where parent and child are reunited. You had the Udanas and Rud Ilal meeting, as well as Onrack and meeting his son and Kilava there. So it does seem to be a place of healing and of wholeness of a sort.
And when we contrast that with a lot of the other warrens and realms that we have seen, which are so dangerous, which are so destructive, which are filled with death and danger and demons and other things beginning with D. But here we see the flip side of magic. We see a flip side of this metaphysical realm,
Yeah.
that it can be something beautiful. And again, it's not that it is some unearthly paradise. Like, animals still hunt each other, things
Oh,
still
yeah.
in the circle of life, and Lion King songs, things still happen, and it's still a brutal reality, but there's a joy to it.
Yes, you have the M Lava and Onrack's taming, I guess, sort of taming of them with help from the Eye. That's quite an interesting relationship that you see there between the Imas and nature. There is a respect and an understanding there, and so many things as he's going through there. He's collecting little leaves and items and things like that to, put in his little toolkit. There is I think a wonderful way in which the Amas, in their innocent state, live in harmony with nature, which is quite a contrast to the unnatural state of them being the undead, which is what we normally see. So,
but also him making the mistake about the taste of the Lava's urine being male instead of female.
yeah.
And it's one little tiny line, and I can just imagine the expression on Quick Ben's face as he goes, "Oh, it tasted this." You're like, "You tasted it." Whoa.
Yeah.
But his collection of all of the things, and it's the useful tools, the making of different weapons, the making of tools, and making of pouches to hold the tools, and then it's the collection of things to make paints, to make dyes, to make, so he can create art.
Yeah.
And everything in that world has a purpose. Everything is related. Everything is connected. So it's a very interesting, and again, a direct contrast, apart from the one that you mentioned, but a big contrast to the Lethari Empire, which is about turning the natural world into a commodity for us.
Exactly. Great segue to, I guess, why don't we go to Letharis and visit the Patriotists, who and perhaps best encapsulate what you were just talking about, that ultimate selfishness, that using the machine to aggrandize oneself. And you have this in a couple pretty loathsome characters. You have Karos Invictad, and he's a bit of a megalomaniac, I guess, compensating for a few things perhaps there. But you also have his loathsome assistant, the one who tortures the good
Janath.
Scholar. What was his name, the assistant?
Oh no, sorry, but he tortures Janath.
Yeah, he tortures Janath. And what was his name? Can't believe I'm blocking his name because he was such a douchebag. Oh yeah, Tunnel Yathfanar. Oops, sorry. Tunnel Yathfanar. I mean, he's a sicko. That's a sick guy. But it's so interesting how even when she's a helpless prisoner, she puts him in his place, calling him little man, and here he wants to be this, aggrandize himself and all of this, and see himself as some kind of genius. In a similar way, he's mimicking Karos Invictad, but she sees right through all that crap, and she says it like it is. He's a little man, right? And people like that don't like the feeling of being small. They want to think that they're somehow big and brilliant or heroic or whatever. But the fact is, I mean, I think someone with the proper sort of humility can see that almost as a beautiful thing. The fact that we are small, and that the fact that we are creatures of a moment, and that we belong to something much vaster than we are. But they seem to have these egos that instead of accepting that, they seem to want to assert their own importance. So,
and one of the interesting things I find about, they are the patriotists, not the patriots. Yeah. Because everything about their patriotism is a lie. It has nothing to do with patriotism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It has everything to do with self-aggrandizing power and the desire for power over others and to inflict pain on others, all in the name of something far grander, to give it a veneer of respectability. And they are a secret police who enact vengeance and enact vendettas and are acquisitive, and they are out for themselves. No matter their grand ideals that they espouse, no matter their speeches, they are all about the self. Karsa and Victa does not care about Letharis.
No.
None of them care about Letharis. They are all invested only in their own pleasures, only in their own power, and they do it all in the grand name of, oh yes, we are on this noble journey, this lie that, and we can take a step back from that particular storyline. Say it's a lie that we tell ourselves sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
About the things that we do. We're doing this with the best of intentions. We have to do it this way because it's important. The ends justify the means. Well, yeah, I know if you look at my actions, you might think they were, slightly sociopathic, but ultimately I was doing it for your own good.
Right, right.
Those are lies that we tell ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
How we justify to ourselves actions that are not correct, that we know aren't correct.
Right.
How we self-rationalize our behaviors. And here we see it again enacted on a grand arena, enlarged and removed from the everyday so that we can judge this. Because we do have people in our world who claim to be patriots. And you look at them and go, but what you are doing, how is that patriotic? How is that a celebration of who we are?
Right.
So I thought it was very interesting. And I know some people, particularly given a lot of the political changes that have happened in the last, sort of 8 to 10 years,
right?
People may sort of read this and go, oh, Erikson is definitely talking about this thing.
But he wrote it before it. Yeah.
This was written before a lot of stuff happened. This was not what Erikson was focusing on. This is about that grander point that throughout history, there have been men who have risen up into power on this grand ideal of, oh yes, we're doing this on your behalf, when it has been about lining their own pockets, where they have sold lies and ideas to people. They have made them afraid. They have sold them on fear and said, we are the only people who can protect you.
You have to love, though, how Tehol punctures the self-aggrandizing narrative as the bloated thing it is, with the mischievous gift of a two-headed insect. That he exposes the whole thing, the absurdity of it all, with this little puzzle that goes around and around and around and drives Karos and Victad to insanity, and exposes everything. I mean, it's just such a great touch. Who would have thought of this sort of thing? It's a great touch, don't you think?
And one of the things I love in particular about that scene is Tehol knows he's going to pay for this.
Oh yeah.
He knows Karos and Victad is not going to live up to any of his promises. He knows that this is bad, and he's still, you know what? No, I'm still going to do it because I'm not letting you think that you can get away with this. I am going to point out to you, you are not as smart as you think you are. Yeah.
At that moment when he tells the two-headed insect to run.
And I think, again, Tehol and Bug are again, like their humor, their banter between them is much needed relief for a lot of the darkness here, because Janath's storyline is again devastating and brutal and emotive and powerful. And regardless of whether or not you in particular enjoy Tehol and Bug's style of humor, you can see why it is there to act as this counterpoint to that darkness that's there with something as powerful as what Janath goes through, and that sexual abuse, assault, and rape, and that imprisonment. Like that torture is difficult to read.
It is. It's tough.
And I think what makes it even more difficult is that's not something that is just made up. That's not something that just exists in a fantasy world. We all know that happens in our world every day.
It happens. That is true. And that's why it is actually, as difficult as it can be to read stuff like this, I think it's important to confront it and acknowledge that this is part of our world. And It's a tough storyline. It really is. And you can see where a person like Janath, whatever his name is, Yathvanar, is trying to make himself into more than he is, but that he is this little man. And ultimately, I don't know. I mean, there is the moment when Janath clearly saves herself. She isn't saved by someone else. She strangles him in the end by using her wits. But it's not there's nothing satisfying about that storyline to me. It was very difficult to read, and the trauma of it all was tough. But I'm glad that authors like Stephen Erikson do confront things like this in literature, and I think he does a great job of it, exploring not just the terrible incident itself, but the repercussions and the reasons. And these are important things to explore if we're going to understand these things. So I think it's well done.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things is, obviously, initially, she's rescued by Mael. The first time. She's rescued by Mael, and he gives her a magical healing. The thing I think that we kind of wanted for Felicen. And we see how in this storyline, that's actually, it cheapens, it removes an aspect of who Janath is to deny her that. As painful as it is, it's removing part of her autonomy, part of who she is, part of her very essence. And then we have the repetition of the capture and the same thing. And Janath, as you point out, is the one that frees herself, enacts her own vengeance. And again, in some respects, that is far more satisfying because it gives the power back to her. She's not just a damsel in distress to be rescued by a convenient male god. But it is so brutal. It is difficult to talk about. It is difficult to think about, and it is not pleasant. Literature doesn't always have to be pleasant. Literature doesn't always have to be entertaining. Literature can be cathartic. It can be emotive. It can be challenging. And this is one of those aspects. It's not an easy storyline. And I think, like Felicen's storyline, like other storylines like Seren Pedek, we have seen aspects of this. And again, Erikson uses that technique of showing us it from different angles and seeing it from the perspective of the rapist. That is one of the most disturbing things, because it's not, you can see he's lying to himself. He keeps saying it's about love. You know, it is not about love. You know, it's not even about attraction. It is about power. And that mentality, seeing that, it makes your skin crawl.
It does. You can see him being insulted by Karos and Victad and taking it out on whoever he can, and in order to make himself feel better. So there's a lot of anguish in that. There's also in another storyline with a lot of anguish in it in Letharis is Rulad's. What a tragic figure. I mean, this is a fellow who I already felt bad for in Midnight Tides and going forward, but it's the child emperor who he was definitely out of his element the entire time, and he became more and more and more isolated because of the manipulations of people like Tribun Null, the chancellor, and Karos and Victad, these seasoned politicians who were using him. And he is, of course, increasingly mad as well because of the sword he's carrying and dying and coming back so many times, and being the pawn as well of the crippled god. So it's a tragic figure.
He is a tragic figure. He is manipulated by these other people. He is tortured in these ways. But he's also the author of his own tragic demise in a lot of respects, because he was ill prepared to be an emperor, but he acts like a child because, he kind of is an adolescent. But his banishment of his brothers, his punishment of Troll when Troll returned to him, because he acted out of rage instead of thinking.
Right.
And that's why he's so easily manipulated by the others.
Right.
So he
Well,
is both a figure you can pity and feel sorry for and view as tragic, as a tragic victim.
yeah.
But he's not without his own blame.
This is true. But, let's put it this way. I did a lot of stupid things when I was a teenager, but I didn't end up with a magic sword stuck to me, a bunch of coins embedded in my flesh, and 1,000 deaths and everything else, fortunately. So, yeah.
Yeah. You also didn't ask for your brother's betrothed as a wife to
No, I
get
did. I
one
don't
up
have
on
any
him.
brothers, so yeah.
And the palace intrigue, the intrigue of all of the political and economic machinations in Lether, is a really, for me, a very interesting storyline. I'm not an economist. I'm not an accountant. So looking at all of these things going on and getting more of an insight into what it was Tehol had actually been doing, what their grand plan was that we had heard so much about in Midnight Tides, and seeing aspects of that, seeing it come to fruition. Fascinating aspect to all of this, because again, so much of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, it's not about just the one book, it's the interconnectedness of all of these different novels to create that entire singular narrative.
Yeah, and there's a bit of chaos in it all too. You have other players like the Feather Witch and the Errant with his little nudges and everything else going on there, and they add other elements to this whole thing that's going down in Letharis. So they have some interesting storylines, but the ones that really blew me away, where I felt, okay, this is really cool stuff, was with Karsa and Epigraphs. And they're evolving. Karsa also, by the way, his relationship with Samar Dev being an important part of that. And of course, separately, but also connected, what goes on with Epigraphs. So two very interesting lines here, I think, that come to quite an interesting conclusion in Reaper's Gale. We're not done with them, but what a thing to happen with Karsa, for example. I mean, wow.
One of the things that I love about Karsa's relationship with Samar Dev is the fact that he comes with this brash. He's a giant. He's massively physically powerful. He's this almost demigod on Earth. And he keeps saying to Samar Dev, "Oh, come here, woman, and you're going to sleep with me," and all of this bragging. And Samar Dev just looks at him and is like, "No." Just go, nope, not having any of that. Go away. And Karsa is, what I love about it is Karsa just go, "Oh, okay," and he'll try again another time.
Right.
He doesn't push it. He doesn't press the issue. This is part of their relationship with one another. And I love the fact that Samar Dev just treats it as, you idiot.
And she cares for him though too. At the same time, like when he's putting himself in danger with the Emperor, she is genuinely afraid for him. There's a piece of her that cares for this companion of hers, and so that encounter really quite something. And of course, Karsa's taking the sword in his thigh, and that becoming the means by which he defeats this mechanism of Rulad coming back and coming back and coming back, and then finally beating the tar out of the crippled god, going back to his place and meeting him in his little realm, and giving him his comeuppance, I suppose, is one way to look at it, right?
Yeah, the number of people who have turned up in that tent to beat the tar out of the crippled god, you thought he'd have learned by now.
Yeah, poor guy, poor crippled god. Yeah. So, but then you also have Epigraphs, right? And his, that's a clever part of this whole thing, that the mechanism that he had put there, whatever long ago it was, we don't even know, but it's just layers and layers. It's built on, it's under the silts in the river. It's just pieces of this mechanism that he had built. So he's been there, and he has these vague memories of it, and he's becoming increasingly composed, increasingly aware of his past, and he's sort of flicked aside Terralak Veed as his friend, and he's, I think, more and more gaining a sense of what he is. Of course, the element that he introduces in there is very destructive at the end. It isn't quite as destructive as we might have feared, but people die when this machine comes to life, right?
And well, there's a reason he's called Life Stealer.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's connected to the laughing god, that that it's a wonderful thing, because it's explained basically almost entirely in the epigraphs.
Right.
That you make that connection, and then you get a little bit of it in the conversations in chapters. But it's the epigraphs actually spell a lot of it out. But Icarium's fascinating, because again, it's not that he's recovered all of his memories. It's not that he's now not as confused. He's seeing things clearer. He's getting a better sense of who he is, not necessarily remembering everything.
Right.
And we see again that aspect, that theme of technology and innovation being both creative and destructive, making life better for things and making life worse. That it's not the technology in and of itself, it's how it's being employed. And we see that with the Kachin Chamal Skykeeps. How Rake used Moonspawn was very different to how the Kachin Chamal used it before Rake got it, or used their ones. So it's an element of this where, again, we keep being confronted with technology, the use of munitions that the ancient powers haven't wrapped their head around how powerful these things are, because they're still operating on, you either hit me with a big stick or you use magic, and I'm immune to magic. Blast me with magic. What's this thing? And it's not something that they've considered before.
Right.
Yes, and this is a fascinating thing about power dynamics in the Malazan world. There are these massively magical, powerful people, physically powerful people, physically and magically powerful people, but it's not that you then get a 10-point scale and, well, they're a level 9 and they're facing off against this person who's level 7.
Right.
That's not how this works. That's not how life works. Like, who's more deadly, the sniper or the swordsman? And you go, well, if they're standing right next to each other, my money's on the swordsman. If they're standing a mile apart, my money's on the sniper. Power is not easily quantifiable like that. And that's what we see here. We see the errant and feather witch, this fighting over power, the god and the worshipper, the bonds between them. And that's a dark mirror of the bonds between Tehol and Bug.
Yep. And you also have, of course, you have the laughing priest guy and
Icarium.
Icarium, thank you. Yeah. So you have it all over the place, the relationship between worshiper and worshipped. And it's not necessarily just not powerful versus powerful, is it? There's a relationship there. There's a symbiotic thing going on here.
So that's one of the things that I, again, find fascinating, because it's not about, here's a straightforward thing. It's, here's this narrative space, investigate it, think about it, look at it from the different angles. And it's one of the things that I enjoy. Now, Philip, I will say, we've been going for quite some time here. I know we want to get to discussing the Malazan stuff.
Yeah.
But why don't we call it here? And then we can do another video, because I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of the Malazans, in particular, certain characters.
Okay.
And rather than try and rush through it in 5 or 6 minutes, we can schedule a talk at another time to concentrate fully on that, to give it the exploration it deserves. Because as we said at the beginning, there is a lot happening in Reaper's Gale. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of development, a lot of lore is being explored, a lot of the world is being explored, mysteries are being solved, mysteries are given new light and context and content. And we've tried to go through this, but there's still so much left to talk about.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think that would be fun to get together and talk about the Malazans. And there are certain characters that I know our viewers are going to want to discuss as well in that part of Reaper's Gale. And so let's give it the justice it deserves. So great idea. Yeah.
Okay. Well, all that remains then is for me to say thank you so much, Philip. I genuinely enjoy this. I like we respond to different parts of the text in different way. We have slightly different perspectives on it, and that helps me learn. That helps me see it differently, and it inspires new directions of thought and appreciation. So thank you very much for these discussions, Philip.
Oh, thank you, AP. Always a pleasure.
And for those of you watching, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.